Hello and welcome. I'm Siddharth Zarabi and you're watching Business Today Television. The recent G20 summit at New Delhi was a success. And one of the key elements that emerged from the unanimous leaders' declaration was a call for reform to ensure that multilateral development banks become bigger, better, and more efficient. I'm today joined by the two co-chairs of the special expert group that led to this. Lawrence Summers, prominent economist, former Treasury Secretary of the United States of America and President Emeritus of Harvard University. Welcome to the show.
Good to be with you.
Thank you. Also with us, Mr. NK Singh, a name everyone knows in India, prominent Indian economist, academician, and a policymaker with many decades of public service in India. He was the chair of the 15th Finance Commission and is currently the president of the Institute of Economic Growth. Welcome, sir. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Let me begin by asking you, Professor Summers, about a recent talk where you said the world is on fire, and then you linked it to the reform of the multilateral banking system, a system that's been there for many decades now. What led you to this conclusion?
There are two parts of it. The first is the degree of global challenge we face right now. Millions of square miles of land were destroyed in fires this past summer, and that's just indicative of what is happening with the challenge of global climate change, which clearly raises such profound issues for the future of humanity. At the same time, we still face substantial pandemic threats. My guess is that we'll see another challenge like COVID within 2 decades. We see for the first time in a very long time major war in Europe with substantial spillover consequences in terms of grain prices, food availability for much of the world. So it's a very dangerous moment in the world. And at the same time, it is a moment that is pregnant with opportunity to make lives better. We've seen more progress over the last 25 years in bringing down child mortality, in bringing up literacy than we have seen at any point in the past. And given how far those rates of child mortality have come down, then we will see at any point in the future. And if we want to keep that progress going in the face of these challenges, we need more capital to flow to the developing world. We need it to flow in better, stronger ways that address these key global challenges. And that is the function of global development banks. Uniquely among international organizations, they don't just bring nations together to talk, they bring nations together to do on common planetary problems. Uniquely among ways in which governments can devote their money, they have extraordinary leverage. $1 appropriated by the United States, in some contexts, can generate $25 of lending to the developing world. And they represent the world's most serious effort yet at genuine global governance, because their real decision making is taking place by all the shareholders, including rich countries and developing countries alike. And that's why it seems to me they need to be the tip of the spear as we address these global challenges and try to keep the global opportunities coming. And that's the central theme of our report. And then we go into a wide variety of more specific issues, the importance of tripling the level of funding by the end of this decade, the importance of their doing their business in new ways, ways that work much more closely with the private sector, ways that work much more closely with each other,
right,
ways that use innovative finance. If we're able to do all of that, I think this is a moment with all the problems that is also pregnant with opportunity.
Absolutely, and opportunity is something that is important for India. Mr. Singh, when the global financial crisis happened, by one estimate, over $222 billion were deployed by the banks into addressing that particular crisis. There is data which suggests that post-COVID and the response to COVID, the spending has been much lower. Is this, according to you, a classic example of why MDBs need to be fixed? And while you tell us about that, what role do you think India has played in this entire debate?
Well, I think that let me begin from the last part of your question, the role of India. Even before India assumed the presidency of the World Bank, the Prime Minister had repeatedly emphasized the need to restructure the Multilateral Development Bank as an integral part of restructuring the overall international financial architecture. Indeed, if you look at the discussions of President Biden and Prime Minister Modi during his last visit to the United States, the paragraph 40 of that very meaningful set of recommendations contained in that is about strengthening the multilateral development banks. So as a group, at the time of the Bangalore second meeting of the governors of central bank and finance ministers, decided to constitute a group of which both of us are privileged to be the co-conveners. It has a distinguished membership, and we have been able to give a report which, as Larry pointed out, is basically a triple mandate. What's the triple? The triple is that in addition to poverty issues and shared prosperity, which remain, of course, unalienable, poverty numbers have gone up, shared prosperity has gone down. And so in addition to that, of course, we now have the issue of global challenges, of transboundary issues, of climate, of pandemic, of fragility of countries, of the high debt profile, and large parts in which you require to have substantially higher levels of concessional and non-concessional finance. That is why, in our recommendation, in short, we have suggested that what is needed is roughly $3 trillion a year between now and the end of this decade. Out of that, $2 trillion will come from countries' own domestic resource mobilization. The $1 trillion will come half from the private capital, $500 billion, and half from a significantly enhanced concessional and non-concessional forms. To give you a broad estimate, currently, all MDBs taken together, and they are quite a large number, much larger than you think. They are currently, I think, certainly 16 or 17, if not more. Of course, we know the prominent ones, the World Bank Group, the Asian Development Bank, the African Development Bank, the Inter-American Bank, and the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. We know the more prominent ones, but as a family, they are fairly large. And all taken together, roughly, leaving out the bump in the pandemic year, they lent about only $120 billion. If our recommendations are accepted, we expect that this, taken along with concessional finance, will be closer to the $400 billion mark, which is tripling on the concessional finance, which is IDA, which is needed to address issues of poverty and for countries in low-income countries, and of course very substantially augmented International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, which will address both middle-income countries and lower-income countries. So that's the central piece. That, as Larry pointed out, is by two critical ingredients. One, in optimizing their balance sheet and improving the efficiency and quality and the way in which they function, and of course to harness private capital more imaginatively.
Taking it forward, Professor Summers, do you really think that the change has to start emanating from the United States? The declaration is there. There's a paragraph which makes this very evident. But in terms of the specific implementations, what's your own sense? How do you think it will pan out?
I want to start by saying that the G20 has existed for now about 20 years. And I think it has had two major moments. It had a major moment in London at the height of the financial crisis, and it has had another major moment with Prime Minister Modi's leadership coming from India. And so I think the Delhi Declaration is a very important set of steps. Inevitably, what happens will depend upon the choices of many countries. The United States was really the central country founding many of these development banks. It is the largest shareholder in the largest banks. And so I think decisions made in Washington will have an enormous amount to say. I know that President Biden is very committed to international leadership in a way that is much less dictatorial and is much more cooperative with the nations of Asia, of Latin America, of Africa, than has often been the U.S. tradition. So I don't want to make any absolute prediction. We've got an enormously complex set of domestic politics in the United States, but I think there's a lot of will, and I think the ball got pushed down the road in a quite meaningful way in this last G20 meeting. And I think the next important step is going to be the Marrakesh IMF World Bank meetings. And I'm going to be looking for leadership from the heads of the institutions. I'm going to be looking for leadership from Secretary Yellen. I'm going to be looking for continuing leadership from the Indian finance minister. And I think with all of that effort, this agenda can move forward in a significant way. And we don't have a lot of time to waste, given what seems to be happening to the global climate.
Absolutely. Mr. Singh, this is the report that's already been submitted. There's another second part that's also going to be presented. Can you share with us what that is going to be? What's the focus of that part?
I don't think that there would be dramatic surprises, because in the first report itself, we have addressed the issue of what we believe will be the key ingredients of the second endeavor, on which is now in an advanced stage because we are getting very close to Marrakesh. We would be presenting that report certainly in person. Both Larry and I have the privilege of accepting the invitation of the finance ministers of G20 to do so on the evening of the 12th of October. So that doesn't leave out too much time, and then need time for consultations. So we are well on the way of the second report, so to say. And this is certainly going to address several issues, one of which, an important one, is what kind of a change in the operating model will greatly improve and make the MDBs much better. What kind of cohesiveness within the MDB family will optimize their lending operations in a more meaningful way, like in terms of sharing data, like in terms of having the same standards of evaluation, improving on project time, improving the time taken from conception to disbursements. Currently, the World Bank, for instance, takes more than 22 months to do so. Can that be cut down to, let us say, half? So we are going to certainly focus on the vastly better bank. In addition to that, of course, we are also going to look at what are the creative ways of harnessing private capital in a more meaningful way, far more meaningful. Larry pointed out dramatically that one of the great success of the multilateral development banks has been its very efficient financial intermediation, in which this has been leveraged in a very significant way. Alas, that is not the position when it comes to private capital. So what kind of risk mitigation and what kind of changes, let us say, in the way in which you look at guarantees, the way in which, and that's easier said than done, because it requires a certain skill on human development side, which many of these multilateral development banks do not have to retrain, to refix their target in being able to creatively use, for instance, guarantees or other kinds of innovative finance, hybrid capital, blended finance, and targeting kinds of financial structures which we have not yet seen. So I think that all taken together, we are looking forward that this second report will outline the framework for a better, bolder in terms of the ability to take risks, and of course a bigger multilateral development banks as a whole.
Professor Summers, this sounds like a new deal for the entire multilateral architecture. But I want to sort of take this beyond that. We are living in a world where there is a lot of economic uncertainty. We are also seeing the economic order that we've seen in the last 30, 40 years unravel a bit. US and China decoupling, regional trade being preferred over multilateral trade, the state that the WTO is in. Is what you are suggesting in terms of the multilateral development bank reform linked to the broader situation that we are seeing as far as deglobalization, if I may use that word, is concerned?
It is a very different problem to build a new highway than it is to fix a highway on which traffic needs to flow.
And India is building so many highways.
But that needs to be rebuilt. And so I think that the way of managing globalization going forward is of the second kind. We can't stop and deliberate on what the optimal system is going to be and then put it in place. That was the luxury they had in many ways, given that the Second World War had destroyed almost everything in 1944. That's not the kind of choice that policymakers have today. So inevitably, it's going to be a process of rolling and incremental reform, and it's for people like NK and I to try to point up what seemed to us to be the low-hanging fruit, the areas where the most can be accomplished with the least disruption. I don't think we're likely to see a return to the degree of comity that prevailed between the United States and China 20 years ago. I think the steps that have been taken in China make that very unlikely, and perhaps aspects of the US reaction make it very unlikely as well. So I think that the system is going to resolve and change in many ways. But when I hear people talk about how the world's becoming deglobalized or less globalized, I have a quite different view. Yes, there is less movement by governments to negotiate new treaties and agreements. Yeah, there is. And maybe even some backsliding on some existing agreements. But I actually think that historians will look back and say that that is small beer compared to the difference that digitalization is making, compared to the way in which every citizen on the planet more or less has access to every other citizen on the planet because of the internet, because of the smartphone, because of the increasing ability that we're all going to have to benefit from knowledge anywhere that becomes knowledge everywhere through artificial intelligence. So I have very little doubt that we are going to be a more global society over time, not a less global society. And that's going to require new forms of management, that's going to require new issues to be addressed. But I don't find the paradigm of deglobalization to be a helpful paradigm.
I'm glad you said that. A quick follow-up before I go to Mr. Singh. India's digital stack is being spoken about, and we've seen practically millions and millions of Indians, hundreds of millions actually, being benefited by digital technologies and at a scale which was not imagined even 5 years ago. How do you see this Indian digital revolution that everyone is talking about?
It's an extraordinary thing. You know, if you think about it, this is a cutting-edge technology, and it's a cutting-edge technology that is more pervasively available at much lower cost in India than it is in the United States. When electricity was a cutting-edge technology, that wasn't true. When television was a cutting-edge technology, that wasn't true. When the jet plane was a cutting-edge technology, that wasn't true. And so this idea of leadership from behind is, I think, a very powerful idea in this new world, and I think it points to enormous potential for India and a very large role for India in the global system, because India has shown a capacity to master the digital that I think is many people are going to want to emulate, that's going to create many opportunities for Indian firms and Indian entrepreneurs. You know, last time I was here, 5 or 6 years ago in India, I remarked, and I think it was an accurate remark, that in no year in the past 30 had India grown as rapidly as China had. Well, I think the overwhelming likelihood is that over the next decade, India is going to grow significantly more rapidly than China does, and that's going to have a very important set of implications for India's role in the world.
Mr. Singh, how important will the India-US relationship be to deliver that kind of growth? Also because we see this personal chemistry of sorts between President Biden and Prime Minister Narendra Modi. How important will that be? And you have observed the India-US relationship perhaps longer than anyone in public life in India.
So I think that there is absolutely no disagreement that the Indo-US partnership has really deeply strengthened in recent years, both under the leadership of President Biden and Prime Minister Modi. And I think that we have increasingly become partners in multiple ways, apart from economic cooperation in the area of strategic issues, in the area of, for instance, defense and metrics, in terms of procurement policy, and of course extending to the social sphere in the education and healthcare systems. I see that partnership gather much greater momentum. And I believe in something that Larry just mentioned, that it's not deglobalization. If you ask me, the world is become rapidly a village. It was many years ago that somebody had used the expression, the world is flat. But I think nobody had at that time contemplated the transformational power of digital technology combined with artificial intelligence, which is going to significantly alter everything which we have known in the way in which educational institutions are run, the pedagogy of the systems, the ability to mix many kinds of disciplines. The new India's educational policy to some extent embeds that thought of really mixing up the best talent in terms of mixing a multiplicity of disciplines. In no other way, for instance, can we harness agriculture more imaginatively than, for instance, as we were discussing, that less and less dependence on fossil fuel kind of things in terms of the fertilization, in terms of the use of irrigation and water, cropping patterns which are more in consummate with the needs of environmental management and planning. And I think that India is at the cusp of change when we are seeing this kind of transformational, not only in terms of the impact on overall growth trends, but the decisive impact in the entire social matrix of the way in which people act, behave, they move, in terms they conduct their agricultural operations, and a long way still to go on health and education. But given all this momentum which has been built up under this leadership, that is something which will bring about transformational changes in multiple ways which are beyond our recognition today.
Professor Summers, you recently spoke about India's growth, and you said it can achieve 8-fold growth by the middle of the century. at 8% annual growth. Given what's happening in the overall economy and how that's impacting individual countries, exports, what do you think India needs to do to achieve that kind of growth?
India needs to be lucky in there being a successful, growing, peaceful, all things considered, safe global economy. Because India won't achieve that growth without the global environment being congenial. India needs to have reform in key sectors, in agriculture, with respect to aspects of the tax system and the banking system, probably most crucially, issues of what we would call fiscal federalism in the United States, issues having to do with regional governments and national governments and the relationship between them. So reforms. Third, India needs to continue to be more open to the world. You know, more American students were visiting college students in Costa Rica last year than were visiting college students in India. That's in part because of the parochialism of some of our college students, but that's in part because there's been less opportunity to recruit, attract, and involve them in India than there should have been. That's one example of the incredible opportunities that India can have from openness. They include benefiting from the extraordinary diaspora of non-resident Indians. They include fostering connections and promoting trade and welcoming inbound investment. India is still too inward looking, even after all the improvements of the last decade. And last,
if I may interrupt you, why would you say that? Why is it still inward looking?
There are still more restrictions, more need for licenses. If someone wants to come and get a business, there was more challenge associated with my getting a long-run visa in order to come for this trip to India and subsequent trips than with respect to most other countries that I would visit. I'm not sure all the reasons. I suspect it's mostly the tradition of a large, inward-oriented society, and that takes a long time to change those traditions. And I think the last thing is, and this is where there's probably been the greatest progress, is a government focused on providing platforms for prosperity. Whether it's, there have been extraordinary changes in the infrastructure of your country since I started coming 30 years ago, but for all the changes there have been, the needs, if there's going to be wireless universally, if there's going to be universal access to clean energy. You are leading, you are doing cutting edge things in renewable energy technology, and it is a fantastic thing. And there are not many countries that have more capacity to use the sun as a source of electricity than India does. And yet, you are also building coal-fired power plants that are fouling the Earth's atmosphere and are causing children to die because of the particulates in the air in your urban centers at a very rapid rate. So government's role in shaping the direction of key sectors, particularly the digital sector and the energy sector, along with openness, along with reform, along with a congenial international environment, with those four things, I think that India can dare to hope for 8% growth. And if we think about an India with an economy 8 times as large as the one that it has today, that is something that would change the lives of every Indian and would change the global economy in a very profound way.
Absolutely. Mr. Singh, I want you to respond to what Professor Summers said, more inward looking, and also the bit about coal, because there's a glide path towards moving towards sustainable energy. We can't switch off our thermal plants just tomorrow morning. Do you agree with what he said? Have we actually turned more inward looking?
No, I think that, I think that it's in a broader sense that Larry was talking about, because he did mention about the enormous changes which have taken place in the quality and reliability of our infrastructure, for instance. I think in terms of the way in which our macroeconomic stability and the framework has guaranteed continued high rates of economic growth, whereas in the few countries where the leadership has been so deeply committed to maintaining macroeconomic stability and fiscal prudence, even under distressing times like the pandemic.
Absolutely.
There are few countries which have, for instance, used the problems and the crisis of a pandemic to push through very difficult reforms of the systems and processes, or moving towards much greater deregulation. For instance, in multiple areas, in the areas of the way in which you viewed public outlays, moving away from public enterprises, in allowing private capital to flow in, looking forward to a further area of banking deregulation. But I think that the areas which Larry pointed out, some of them are significant, that we need much greater reforms, for instance, on the factors of production. And these factors of production are known. Some of it, of course, is embedded in the quality and nature of our federal polity. Because, for instance, on issues of land, on land titles, on the easy availability of land, that's a subject which is assigned to the states, and therefore getting the federal compact to become a meaningful way in the way in which they become active participants in the reform process would be very important. I think to take advantage of the kind of the emerging digital era, and with the power of artificial intelligence and the nature of our new education policy, we need to have a similar one on health. We need to have a policy which enables the greater use of this transformative digital technology in assuring high quality of health care and high quality of imparting education, with as wireless is going to prove an increasingly effective means to do so. So I think there are enormous challenges, but I believe that the opportunities and our ability and the record to grasp these opportunities would enable us to triumph over the challenges and to play an even more meaningful role on the becoming an important economic shaper of global decision making than has been possible earlier. And I think that we are well positioned right now, given the geopolitics, given as the fact that, as Larry pointed out, that he doesn't see that in the foreseeable future US-China relationship will revert to what it was. I think that's an opportunity, looking at the new arrangement and the new prospects which we have as part of a liberal Western democracy, in a certain sense, with a variation on the Westminster model, to bring about a qualitative change in the life of an average Indian in terms of his availability of goods and services, and with predictability and assurance of continued political stability, would be very, very crucial in shaping not only India's future, but influencing the future of the global economy as a whole.
We recently at Business Today interviewed Prime Minister Narendra Modi, and during that conversation he spoke about how we should focus on India plus one in terms of the confidence that India has. But before I let you go, Professor Summers, I have to ask you about your reading of the United States economy, an economy which still drives sentiment and capital flows all across the world. It's also very, very important for the Indian markets. What shape is the US economy in currently?
I think many of the long-run fundamentals are very good. Our capacity for dynamism, our capacity for continued labor force growth, our capacity, even with all the challenges, to accept very talented immigrants. There's a lot that's positive in the U.S. economy. I do think that achieving a soft landing and avoiding a near-term recession or continuation of high inflation is going to be a challenge going forward, and the Fed doesn't have an easy job in doing that. But if you look through the fluctuations of the near term, I think if we are able to maintain political stability, if we're able to maintain sound policies, that the U.S. economy has very great potential.
That's very, very important, and potential is what is very significant for global growth. Mr. Singh, a final word to you on the conversation today, and I go back to what we discussed, and this is, the decades that have passed to reach this point where India could stand up and not only organize a G20 summit, but achieve a consensus which many people, literally like hours before, thought was unthinkable. What does it represent for India, and what would young Indians, what should they take away from it?
I think that several things. First and foremost, a feeling of satisfaction that the economic changes and liberalization which began 30 years ago have only gathered momentum. It has brought about greater assurance and improved life quality. It has made a deep dent in poverty. It has brought about fundamental changes in the quality of education and healthcare than 30 years ago, the quality of infrastructure which it has. It's a feeling of satisfaction of India having achieved far more than some of the critics of India would have reckoned at that time. Second, I think it has brought about what political stability, leadership whose abiding faith in the overall macroeconomic framework will bring about a much greater recognition in a world beset with uncertainties. And the third, that India can do it, it can improve on what it has achieved, a somewhat difficult and a complex task to bring about a consensus when divisive forces were far more, when the geopolitics were far more fractured, is indeed a matter not of complacency, but by no means a matter of mean satisfaction. And I think that it is that feeling of having achieved which must spur the ambition further to improve on the already excellent track record which we have demonstrated during our leadership. As Larry pointed out, that there have been two presidencies which he recalls, one at the time of the global financial crisis and the other one is now. This is, coming from Larry, no mean certificate for a country like India, which is beset with its own challenges. But the huge ability to grasp opportunities is a matter which fills all of us with a sense of pride.
We started the conversation with your term on the world being on fire, and the conclusion that I draw from the time that both of you have given us is that India can perhaps help douse that fire in many meaningful ways. Professor Summers, NK Singh, thank you very much for your time with us today. With that, it's a wrap on this conversation. Two leading minds who have given us a broad picture of what is really key to the world of tomorrow. If you've been, thank you very much for watching.
If you like the video, do like, comment, share and subscribe.